Thanks for coming out under such adverse circumstances. We've got everything against us. We've got the weather, we've got acts of God and government and everything. It's just crazy. So let's do the ceremonial Pharrell.
Yeah, get that going.
Where are we?
It's the new hello, and this is David Bushman. Have a seat, gentlemen. So David Bushman wrote Conversations with Mark. That is our gong that lets us know we're beginning. We always begin with a gong.
Repeat what he wrote again. We couldn't hear the gong.
Yeah, in the gong. I know, that's what we're here. So David Bushman wrote Conversations with Mark Cross. These two men had over 20 conversations together. It's a Larry David table. Mocha Joe made this table.
Mocha Joe.
This is a Mocha Joe table.
Not so good, Mocha Joe.
So they had 20 conversations, and
more than 20.
Yeah. 20.5. And that became this new book that just was released this week, which is Conversations with Mark Cross.
Great timing.
Yes. So let's start with you, David.
Yeah.
Where did you come up with this idea to do Conversations with Mark Cross?
So I've been a long time admirer of Mark's work. Twin Peaks obviously is what I think it's fair. In fact, I think I asked you this question. I think it's fair to say that's what you're best known for. But I worked for 27 years at the Paley Center for Media, and I've known a lot. I've studied TV history for a long time, and I knew that Mark's contribution to TV went way beyond that. And I knew that there were so many interesting stories he could tell relevant to the history of TV beyond Twin Peaks. So I knew he came up through the Universal system in the 70s, which was where shows like McMillan and Wife, Columbo, McCloud, Name of the Game, so many shows were produced, and so many great writers came out of that system. And I knew that the writers' room at Hill Street was legendary with David Milch and Stephen Bochco, and so I was motivated by that, but mostly, to be honest, is that, and I think this is my argument, and it's my argument, and Mark had nothing to do with it. I feel like he doesn't get necessarily in all circles the attention he deserves, for revolutionizing TV and actually being largely responsible for the quality of TV that not all by himself, but for the quality of where TV has evolved to today, with shows like Mad Men and Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul and Watchmen. I think Mark doesn't get enough attention for that, so that was kind of where I was coming from when I reached out to him, and he ignored me at first.
And Mark, did you have any trepidation for doing this? You knew to do a book like this, you were going to have to open yourself up. Was it an easy decision, or was it a hard decision?
It was one I wrestled with for a while, simply because I don't like to talk about myself a lot. And I feel secure about what I've done. I know the things that I've done, but I was actually more won over by the argument that, and it's in the subtitle, The Education of a Writer, that my experiences might be useful for people who are just starting out, young writers, people who want to get into the business. Maybe they can learn something and benefit from that. So, and there's a lot of entertaining stories too. I've 45 years in show business. You have some interesting experiences, and we ended up telling a lot of those stories. So that was more my reason for wanting to do it. And I thought, you get to a certain point in you're supposed to be perspective taking in life, right? You get to a point where you look back, you say, okay, what have I done? What can I do? How can I be useful as a storyteller in ways other than maybe just telling stories? And so the book added up to something I wanted to do, to take stock of my own life, and it was a great opportunity to do that. It was actually kind of fun. I grew to really enjoy our sessions, and he was very persistent. He dug up all sorts of stuff that I'd forgotten about, and probably helped me remember stuff that I'll, carry with me the rest of the ride. So I was grateful to David for that.
I think also that one of the lessons, I mean, it's a tough world in Hollywood and trying to make movies and films, and I think, your perseverance, I think that's one of the really important lessons for aspiring writers to learn. It's not, the chart doesn't look like that, it's kind of like
No.
this.
There are no participation medals in show business. It's a Darwinian system. It's very cruel to the people who are working in it. It's notoriously got its mind on the bottom line rather than art more than commerce more than art. But coming of age when I did in the late 60s, early 70s, it coincided with this golden age of, or what they call the silver age of Hollywood, where the studio system was kaput. All those businesses had, as models, had sort of failed. Television had made great inroads into the share that movies had on the American audience. So we had this amazing period from the late 60s until the late 70s, where American contributions to world cinema were probably as great as they've ever been. And you know all the films, the directors. It was Coppola, Scorsese, De Palma, Cronenberg, Lynch. I mean, there was a whole group of people who otherwise might not have had their voices heard. And so I grew up in a period where, weirdly, there was a kind of idealism about the movie business. And you really thought you could do art and commerce kind of 50-50 as a proposition. The people who were making the movies still wanted to make money, they still wanted to be successful, but that wasn't the bottom line. It wasn't corporate executives with no experience in the business, which is what we have now, deciding what stories to tell. It was them backing filmmakers with passion and vision and letting them run with the ball. And look back at that period in American film history, and I always try to encourage younger people to do that, because there's some extraordinary work. I mean, I watched 5 Easy Pieces last week. I just finished a book about Jack Nicholson, and I said, I haven't seen 5 Easy Pieces in years. And it's a masterpiece. I mean, it's some of the greatest performances ever put on film in this country, including Jack's. And that's what film can do. And a lot of that has now fallen to what we call premium television, that kind of storytelling, that kind of melding of art and commerce. But for a brief shining moment, it was all in the movie business. And I was fortunate to land here when it was still going on and to sort of catch the tail end of it. And that was fun.
I'm not sure how many, looking out, people are basically my age. One way that you got to really change television was everyone who was my age that was a kid in the 70s, when we played in the backyard and we were chasing someone, we said
Yeah.
I mean, I was surprised to find out that you started on the $6 Million Man.
Yeah.
I mean, can you even remember working on the $6
Oh
Million
yeah, no,
Man?
it was a big deal at the time,
That show was huge for a kid. Anybody
Yeah.
here watch the $6 Million Man?
Yep.
Does anybody know where Steve Austin was from originally?
Oh.
James does, but he's not going to raise his hand.
Must be Texas somewhere.
Ojai.
Oh, really?
You know where Oscar Goldman's secret lab was, where they rebuilt Steve Austin? Ojai.
Interesting.
You know where Jamie Summers, the
Bionic Woman
was
who
from?
was my first crush.
She was from Ojai. I got to kiss her once. I don't know if that's in the book or not. She wanted to.
Of course she did. Oh
I
my
had
gosh.
her permission. But,
We just me too, Mark Frost. What did we
Was
do?
Was the
And-
dog
and-
from Ojai as well?
was who?
The dog, Jamie Summers' dog.
I'm assuming so. It was probably a family pet, right? And the credit sequence, when he actually, the first time you see him run really fast, he's running along some of the white fences out in the East End. They shot the whole credit sequence up here. So
Wow.
little did I know, I had never heard of Ojai at the time I was writing the show. In fact, I didn't even know that it was a real place. I just thought it was something they made up. So that was kind of a cool thing to move here many years later and remember that. That was kind of my first dive into pop culture with a sort of a hot show. I mean, $6 Million Man for kids anyway was,
Yeah.
that was kind of the top of the heap.
It
So-
was my lunchbox. I mean,
Yeah.
I had the $6 Million Man lunchbox, and
Yeah.
I never knew that you were a part of that.
I actually, I was surprised to learn about 10 years ago that, they merchandised the heck out of that show, as they did most Universal shows. They made a toy of a character called the Robot Maker, who was played by an actor named Henry Jones, who I introduced in the episode that he was introduced in. Somebody gave me one of these, and I realized I've got a toy based on a character I created like 50 years ago. You'll be finding it on eBay any day now. But no, I will not sell the Oscar Goldman Robot Maker
One
dolls.
story that you do
Yeah.
tell in the book about those days is what it was like to go into Universal cafeteria.
Yeah. Universal, which you referenced at the time, was kind of the last remaining intact studio system studio. They were making over 30 hours a week of primetime television at a time when there were only 66 on the air.
That's crazy.
This was Lou Wasserman's business model. He wanted to dominate television, own all the syndication rights, and so when you went to lunch in the cafeteria, first time I ever went to meet Steve Bochco, he had gone to my college, Carnegie Mellon, and a friend of mine named Charlie Hay, do you remember Renko on Hill Street Blues? Charlie was also a Carnegie grad. He had come to direct a play there at the end of my junior year. And he said, well, you ought to come out to LA and meet Steve. And I thought, okay. I mean, I had grown up out here and had moved away when I was 13, so I was eager to go back. My girlfriend was in Los Angeles, so I hitched a ride with some friends, and 3 weeks later I was writing at Universal. I really struggled during those 3 weeks. No, I'm not saying I had it easy, but they greased the skids for me. I was able to show up and do the work.
Television moves fast,
Yeah.
and some things last and some things don't. To me, because I'm of the age, Stephen Bochco, I watched him change television. I don't really know how many young people understand what Stephen did,
Yeah.
but put Stephen's legacy in perspective.
Well, when I met Stephen, he had been at Universal for 10 years. He'd never had a hit show of his own. He was working as the story editor on Macmillan Wife on the Rock Hudson Susan St. James show. It was part of the Wheel with Columbo and McLeod with Dennis Weaver. They would alternate 90-minute mysteries every third week. They were in a rotation. Stephen, when he got the chance, he'd created like 3 or 4 shows that hadn't gone anywhere. And he came up with the idea for Hill Street Blues in, let's say, 82, 83? No, 81. They did a short season, a half season on NBC. Didn't do anything in the ratings. It was a success d'estime. It was everybody saying this is going to change television, but nobody was watching. And the second season was interrupted by a writer's strike. So in the first 2 years, they had only done partial seasons. I joined the staff on the year we did our first full season. I was there for 3 years. So we got to just kind of ride the rocket of that show becoming, if you remember, it was 10 o'clock on Thursdays,
nights, yeah.
which was the must-see TV. That's where that whole phrase came from. Friends was at 9. There was another show at 9:30.
Cheers was on. Cheers was in.
Oh,
Cheers.
sorry, Cheers, not Friends.
I think
Night
Night
Court.
Court.
Yeah, Night Court was there. And then,
Valentine's, maybe.
so it was an exciting time to be a part of that show. And then Stephen went right from that to creating LA Law, which also ran for 7 years. And then right off of that, he went back to Cops and did NYPD Blue for, I think, 12 years, right?
I'm not sure.
It was a long time. So that was Stephen's legacy. He kind of created and perfected the ensemble cast drama in both of those genres. And he later did Doogie Howser, which put him in all 3 of the staples of television: lawyers, doctors, cops. And then he did Cop Rock, where he had singing cops, and that didn't work out so well. Does anybody remember Cop Rock?
Yeah.
It only ran for like half the
Well,
season.
Randy Newman did the
Yeah.
music, and
Right.
actually, this is just a personal question. ignore this, but do you like Randy Newman?
I love Randy.
Because I was thinking you should love the song "Great Nations of Europe." Do you know his album "Bad Love"?
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
all about Europeans conquering and killing everyone with disease as they get there. And in this time, I'm thinking about it all the time. It seems like a Mark Frost album.
Yeah,
so.
no, I'm gonna go order it.
Yeah,
This is
listen to
again.
"Bad Love" by Randy Newman. Every song on it is
One
great.
of the things about Bochco, one is that I think, terribly overlooked show of his is Paris that he did with
James Earl
And
Jones,
there's an
yeah.
episode specifically about the death penalty, and somebody who's executed in the episode, which is incredible.
Yeah.
Which we have at Paley Center. And the other thing is that he and Bruce Paltrow, who is better known as Gwyneth's dad at this point, but they created a show called a pilot called Operating Room,
Yeah.
which was pre
Said Elsewhere.
and pre Hill Street.
Yeah.
Sort of like
It was sort of like
prototype of both
the
of those,
prototype.
right?
Yeah, I agree. So it was an exciting place to work, and it was exciting to. I mean, it was when they started calling it water cooler TV, when people would come in on Fridays and talk about last night's episode of Hill Street. So that was my model for how a television show should work. How you run a show, how you run a writer's room, and how you try to capture an audience. So those were all things I tried to move forward into Twin Peaks with that as my base experience.
Well, one of the main differences I feel like between like Hill Street and Twin Peaks and many other shows is other shows take a long time to get the audience. Twin Peaks is like the exact opposite, where you had everyone the first episode. I mean, nobody knows why anything happens, but why do you think Twin Peaks pilot was so huge that people tuned in?
It was finished almost a year and a half before it aired, so we had a lot of time to try to get word of mouth going. We had a lot of screenings. We had a lot of influencers, as they call them now. You know, critics, writers who saw the show early and talked about it, and it just there were two things about it. One, it had a pretty good hook. Who killed Laura Palmer? It was a mystery. But Laura's death was the greatest exposition machine in history, because it allowed you to tell everybody's story through the lens of their relationship with her. And it was just a beautiful way to introduce the town and create a set of tension right away that people hooked into. But I mean, the numbers have changed so radically. You probably know better than I, but I think we had something like 35 million people watch the pilot.
Right.
Maybe it was more.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Those are like almost Super Bowl numbers today. That many people don't watch the same show anymore. So that's what we got the first night. And ABC, which had been dragging their feet and didn't know if people were going to like it, and were kind of terrified of the show themselves because it broke a lot of their rules. But they were in third place and desperate. So they said, okay, we'll put it on in the spring it's only 7 hours. What's the worst that could happen? And it turned out to be the most talked about show they'd had for, 20 years. So
I've heard that their first promos just did not capture what you guys were going for at all. Do you remember how they wanted to market it and how you guys changed their vision?
Yeah, we scared them early on. We just said, look, no offense, but we're not going to take any notes from you on the show, because I don't think you'd know what it is we're trying to do here. And they said, okay. I mean, they couldn't force us to, and I'll never forget, we were in a notes meeting after we'd handed in the pilot, and the executive took out a list of the notes. He says, now I'm going to go over my notes. Would you like to hear what we thought? And we both went, not really. And it was sort of like hitting him in the face with a 2x4. They just sort of went, they didn't know what to make of it. He just kind of calmly put it back in his pocket. And it's like punching a shark in the nose, I guess, when they get too close to you. They just never brought it up again. Nobody was more surprised than I was, but it worked. And but to your point about they had created a bunch of promos after seeing the show, and one of them I'll describe as they had a character who looked like an old prospector standing next to the Twin Peaks town sign and laughing for 30 seconds, cackling.
Okay.
That was their idea of a promo for the show.
Uh-huh.
They thought, okay, that's going to really pull them in. And at that point we said, no, why don't you let us do them? And so they said, okay. So we ended up making the early promos. It was, the rule book was just out the window. They were just going to go on the ride. If it worked, it worked. If it didn't, hopefully no one would ever write a book about it. Then, as soon as you get the numbers out there, then everything is allowed. Everything parted, and we just did what we wanted to do.
David, you've written about Twin Peaks for many years. You had to prep questions for Mark, knowing that he's had to answer them many times, and a lot has been asked.
Or not.
Well, he's been asked them. Whether he
Right.
answered them or
Right.
not is another thing.
Yeah.
What was it like for you to prep for something that you know so well and Mark has talked at all the time?
Well, I did try as much as possible to stay away from the evergreen questions that have come up time and time again. So that was, important to me to not rehash things that were already recorded, because we've talked about this yesterday, that as a historian, I think it's really important to get history right, because source materials like this become secondary sources for the next person who's going to do a book on Twin Peaks or Mark or whatever, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. So there's also a lot of information out there that's contradictory of things. Obviously we all know one of the big questions was how much David Lynch was around in season 1. So I really kind of tried to focus on things that hadn't been asked before, and things that had been asked before but had been answered in 3 or 4 different ways. Just to kind of set history straight.
Right. So, answer
And
that.
I asked him about everything I didn't understand, but he mostly wouldn't answer.
Well, nobody could answer everything you don't understand. But I'm bummed. I thought I'd have a rim shot. Next time we'll have that guy. Talk about season 1 and your staff. Who was there? And what went on in season 1? I realize that's a big question, but I mean staff-wise.
Well, we'd gotten an order for 6 additional episodes after the pilot. The pilot was 2 hours. Everything else was, a regular hour. So 7 altogether. And so it was what we call a short order. And so I didn't really hire a staff per se. I hired one guy named Harley Tate, who was a friend of mine who was from the film world. He'd never worked in television, but I knew Harley really well, and he was a really smart guy. And I showed him the pilot, and he said, I'll do anything to work on this with you. And so I had faith that he could pull it off. So he was there. And then I hired, I think, 1 or 2 freelancers to come in toward the end of that first session. Otherwise, I wrote them. David and I wrote one of the scripts together. And that was pretty much it for the first season.
What about Bob Engels?
Oh, sorry, Bob was there. My apologies, Bob. Bob was an old friend of mine from Minnesota, and he also came in as a writer-producer, associate producer the first season, and wrote one of the first 7. Harley wrote one of them, and then, as David said, Lynch was off making Wild at Heart at this time. He was shooting it. So aside from writing that one episode with me and obviously doing some press and stuff, he really wasn't there. He was just busy. So my job as the showrunner was to make the show and get the hours ready and show David the scripts and the cuts, and he seemed happy with everything. So everything was going along fine.
Can I just ask, I asked you, I think, a question years ago. I was at a panel where Steve Bushman and David Kelly were both there. And
Yeah.
David Kelly said, who's done like LA Law and
Picket fences.
and the practice. He said that when he has a problem with a script, he's more than likely to throw everybody else out of the room and do the fix it himself. And where Botchko is more likely to bring everybody into the room to try to fix it communally. And my question to you is which method is more your style?
It was more my style when I had a trimmed down group like that to do it myself. And what I'd learned, Stephen didn't do this as much, but I always did the last pass of every script. Whatever the final polish before shooting was always me, and I saw that as part of the job. I didn't mean you were going to take credit on the show, and in fact, it was considered bad form for showrunners to. Unfortunately, there's some who do that, who will try to put their name on every episode. But working for Stephen, he taught me that was the way that you helped your writers grow. You gave them residuals. You gave them a chance to put their name on something, have pride of authorship, and I think you work a little harder when that's on the table. So that was what I tried to do.
When I interviewed Tim Hunter, I'm pretty sure that's correct. No, the guy who directs Larry Sanders a lot.
Todd Holland.
Todd Holland.
Yeah.
He directed the episode that begins in the ceiling and it comes out, and then we come down and we see Leland being interrogated.
Yes.
He got to do the soundscape, and he said he built this whole thing, and he didn't know who did it. He was just doing it, and he gave it to you, and you listened, and he had Cheryl Lee say, "Daddy, no." And to him, it was about, Leland, don't kill Jacques Renault. And you heard that, and that was your one note to him, is remove Cheryl Lee's "Daddy, no," and he walked away from that meeting thinking, huh. So how,
Tim was
did
no
those
dummy.
things happen to you a lot, where someone's writing a script, you know who did it, they don't know who did it? Was that part of your job to make sure that they didn't tip the scale without knowing what's
because
on
we
the
didn't
scale?
tell anybody who had done it. We kept it private. We didn't even tell Ray until he shot the scene, the day he shot the scene, where he is interrogated and ends up being nabbed for it. We actually wrote 3 scenes, and I think we shot them. Did we shoot them, or did we just talk about them? We wanted to do misdirection with the cast because we didn't want the cast to go, "I know who killed her." So we had 3 scenes with different people who had killed her. Richard Beamer was one. Yeah, we shot one with him.
Fred Silver?
Ben Horn. And who?
Fred Silver, was he the third?
Frank Silva.
Fred Silver.
Oh, Frank Silva.
Frank Silver, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. As Bob. So it was, it was like a trade secret. We didn't want anybody didn't want it to get out, and it didn't. I mean, that was the good part. It worked. All the scripts were controlled. Everyone was numbered. So actors were only, James knows because James was in the returns. He only got the pages for the scenes that he was in. He didn't know what episode they were in. I told him the name of the character.
That was nice of you.
That was nice. But so yeah, we wanted to keep it as secret as long as we could.
And then, the famous part, and you guys certainly go over here, is what's considered the downfall in the second half of the season.
The second season.
Yeah, in the second season.
Yeah.
I am actually a fan of season 2. I mean, some people. How do you guys feel about season 2? Let's hear a clap for. Do we like your report? Nobody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it.
I think there's some great episodes. I'm even talking past 16. I mean, there's some rough ones, but I really feel like it's only 2 really rough episodes, which every show in the world has. You have to make 22. Who makes 22 great episodes? Looking back, how do you view that section between Laura's end and Wyndham's introduction?
Well, there were circumstances beyond our control. We had a whole major storyline planned, and do I name names in the book?
I think you.
I don't think he does.
Do I?
He does. He
I'm
does.
Help me remember what wound up in the book and what did.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
now
can't
everyone
remember.
wants the missing pieces of the
Yeah.
It sounds to me like Mark has enough stories for 10 books.
Yeah.
What the actors didn't want to play the story, or one of them did, for whatever reason, doesn't matter. But so we were left literally on the verge of shooting the episode with having to completely scramble the script. Now that happens in television. You do what you have to do to get the episode ready. But we had to do a lot of scrambling for those 2 episodes that you talked about. And the Wyndham Earle storyline with Ken Walsh, who was an actor I'd worked with in Minnesota years before, playing Wyndham, we had to move that storyline up. And I felt we hadn't done it quickly enough, that it didn't have the same roots that the Laura Palmer mystery did. But I think once it got going, it was kind of fun, and it was a great nemesis for Kyle. So that was one element. The other element, which is sort of forgotten, and we do talk about this in the book, is that those episodes started airing right in the middle of war with Saddam Hussein. So if you remember John Arnett standing in front of Baghdad on CNN and the city blowing up behind him, well, we were preempted for like 6 out of 8 weeks in a row because they were cutting live to Baghdad to the bombs falling. And it was a hard enough show to keep track of as it is. And if you suddenly took it away from people for that long, they started to lose the thread. So it was a combination of the story being a little bit weaker than it had been, and I think the circumstantial thing of the show simply wasn't on the air. And then were we already on Saturday nights at this point? In the second season?
Yes.
We were.
Yeah.
And this was what was the craziest thing to me. The show had been at 9 on Thursday, is that right?
Yeah, but
9,
that's cheers.
yeah. And it did, really good business. Saturday has always been known as the graveyard of network television. It's where you put shows that, it'd be great now because it's mostly programming for elderly shut-ins. It was people who couldn't get out, younger people were going out, they weren't watching television. VCRs hadn't really taken hold, it was before DVRs. If you had a show for your grandparents, Saturday was usually the night they were going to put it on television. And they decided to put us on Saturday night. We had been the hottest show in television on Thursdays at 9, which allowed you to have that watercolor Friday. And they thought, I know, we'll move it to Saturday night. And I just went, what is the thinking here? It took the air right out of the balloon. And it was really hard to build an audience. We kept the audience all the way through the end of the Laura mystery, and it hadn't really degraded that much. But at that point, that plus the war in Iraq, we had some real problems.
I think ABC kind of inadvertently did you a favor by waiting to put it on because you had the entire first season written, shot,
Yeah.
not having to worry about anything, that any sort of feedback from there's no internet really at the
Right.
time, but which has really become the model now for shows like Mad Men, and
Yeah.
they don't have to deal with feedback from they can't deal with feedback because the entire season is already written.
It's already written and
Right,
direct,
right.
yeah,
And
done.
I think
and
that was
yeah.
a precedent that you guys set, maybe. I don't know whether may not have been intentional, but I think it's the right way to do it.
Yeah, I mean the model for television is or was 22 to sometimes 26 episodes a year, and I'd learned to do that grind at Universal. That was how all the shows were that length, and it took a lot out of you. It was 9 to 10 months work, and you'd have a couple of weeks off, and then you'd get right back into it again. So I felt it was a real advantage to have 7 episodes to shoot without anybody's having seen any of them, and then know that it's there as a consistent piece of work. And when it came on the air, we were able to kind of not sweat, as you said, how people were going to react because there was nothing we could do. It was the second season where we had the production monster chasing us as we were moving into through the calendar year, where it became a little more challenging.
And then we jump ahead 25 years and you get to come back. In those 25 years, were you always thinking, I bet someday we do Twin Peaks, or did you really never think about it?
We talked about it a couple of times, particularly when the DVDs started to really hit, and a kind of a new generation found the show because they were watching it. We put out a gold box set of the first 2 seasons, kind of at exactly the right time when DVD use was at its peak around 2007, and that started to really ramp up the community again. And a lot of people who'd been living with decaying VCR tapes, and they suddenly had a new way to watch the show, and obviously they had a new way to talk about it because of the internet, and that had never really gone away. There had always been a very lively, very dedicated fan group online who kept it alive, and they started the festivals in Seattle and in London, and they were really nice people, and we tried to accommodate them as much as we could. They became very friendly with a lot of the cast. I mean, you know some of the cast better than I do at this point from all the things you've been to. So in 2007 we said, yeah, maybe, but not quite yet. And then in 2012, I called David up and said, I think I have the way to get back into this. And I took him out to lunch at Musso and Frank's. If you saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that's the famous scene at the beginning. I went there for lunch yesterday before our book signing. I've been going there since 1965. So we had that memorable lunch, and we went back 2 or 3 times to Musso's to talk about it more. And we talked for fully a year before we wrote a word, just to try to map out what had happened, who was new, who was old, what the new world of the show was going to be. And then we wrote in complete secrecy the first 2 hours. And for a number of reasons, mainly because we had a business relationship already with CBS Home Video, which was all under the aegis of Paramount, Viacom, CBS. We thought Showtime would be the right vehicle to bring it back on the air. And so we had a meeting with the CEO. He wasn't the CEO yet. David Nevins, who's an old friend of mine. And they loved it, and they read it and said, we want to do this. And then it was just about making the deal.
Tell me about Dougie Jones. Tell me what you see in Dougie Jones.
Dougie was, I know, a big frustration for a lot of people. But we felt that there's a level in which the story of the return is the spiritual journey of Dale Cooper. He's been kind of severed from himself. He's been reduced to a sort of drooling nincompoop. I mean, a kind of baby, really. He's kind of reborn, and he's got to learn. I mean, that's how we thought of it. We thought, okay, well, he's been to the Red Room, and his evil twin has been out there, which was all set up at the end of episode 22 of the 2nd season. I mean, that was going to be the story for season 3 had we done it then. It was going to be, we weren't calling him Mr. C then, but he was going to be out in the world, and Cooper was going to be trapped, and it's how does he get out and get back and save the day? And so we came up with this idea that he's got to really kind of grow up from infancy